Chapter 19, Death Wherever You Look. Now, knowing that he had again become part of a mean, perverted game of Chenerah, Amarok swore to himself that he would never see this shepherd again. If he did, he would definitely kill him this time, because the psychic blow he had given him was clearly one too many. He imagined, as he had done after the dog had left him, what he would do to Gajaze, should he meet his eyes just once more. Surely it didn't help him in the current situation, but he could hardly distract himself from these thoughts of revenge. Amarok had been gone for a while when Chenerah left the guest house. He held his head, for it was throbbing terribly. His eye was damaged, so he had covered it with a bandage soaked in milk. Of course, his wolf was right, the sheepdog had betrayed him, had put his own goals above those of his friend. That he had been punished was appropriate and justified. But what should this mean for the future of the two, for the fight of the Anthros against the Gajans? He did not know. The dog ran around and asked his fellow wolves where his friend had gone, but they all acted as if they had never seen a wolf. The same was true of his fellow dog Artos, who said he had never heard the name Amarok. Artos, what are you talking about? Amarok was still here yesterday, together with Serena, his queen. I'm sorry, the warrior spoke only contemptuously, but I can't tell you the last time I even saw a Samoyeden. They all lied to him, but seemed so contemptuous and dismissive that the sovereign realized that they seemed to know about Amarok's punishment towards him. Between you and me, Kesar, of course we know Amarok and his queen. But we all saw him come out of the guest house and spit on the floor in a derogatory manner. You know that can't happen, wolf or not, Artos now explained, to which his crony nodded. Chenerah's skull was pounding, yet he wanted to talk to the leader again. Whatever his lover intended to do, time was running out until the Gajans arrived. If his Samo would not help him, which seemed quite understandable to him, then he himself would have to fight for two. Leader dog, my companion has left me, he spoke. Yes, I know. I've already sensed it in your mood, Chenerah. Then I'm sure you know what I'm asking you to do. I am ready in any case. If I have to, I would even fight blindly for us in this country. The old woman nodded. For that you need armor first, don't you? Something that will help you survive the fight against the people's bullet weapons. As the lead dog, she knew everything there was to know. Sometimes one or the other dog had the feeling that she could read minds, but she always denied it. Yes, agreed the male, that's what I was going to ask about. It will be hardly possible for me without protection. I want to defend my country and the Ispasetka from the Gajans. But I can't do that without the protector. Now the female dog laughed briefly, it must not be just a normal armor. No, the Kesar has in mind to wear the holy armor right away. What makes you think that it will submit to you? You must know that not just anyone can put it on. The sovereign pondered for a moment. There were legends about the sacred armor of Alsatiania, in which it was said that this impenetrable shield would choose its own wearer. Unworthy or greedy, power-hungry Anthros would either be crushed by its weight or burned alive by it. But those are all fairy tales, he rebuffed. Let me see if the protector suits me, if it wants to serve me. If not, we have no chance of victory anyway. What difference does it make whether I die without armor or while trying to wear it? Surely there is some truth to this, Chenerah. But be warned, you have no more than a single try, spoke his counterpart, giving him to consider that this piece was not simply some clothing, but rather a technology, the effects of which had not even been checked in modern times. That means that no one has used this part for a very long time? That's right. According to legend, it once belonged to a Kesar who lived several hundred years ago. Who made it is still not clear. We are welcome to look at it. It's here in the basement in a display case. The offer pleased the Kesar and so he followed the leader into the basement of the small building. There were many weapons hanging on the old wooden walls and several statues stood here, each dressed in armor from a bygone era. There were old relics, iconic objects and all sorts of scrolls in this room. Sayings and legends had been written down here, always commissioned by the respective leader. A few swords with wide blades could be found as well as very old, traditional strukos, massive batons, which could only be used by Alsatian fighters. Where did you get all this stuff? Asked Gajaze with interest. The female dog smiled and explained, all these are relics from other times, accumulated over the centuries by my predecessors. There is a lot of knowledge, history, explanation found here. And you were able to put it here and archive it because the builder of this world can't see this place? Now you seem to have it figured out what this place is for, she praised, making a prompting hand gesture that meant the warrior could look around the room. But he only spoke, "I'll use that stuff to cover our men, lead dog." "You can't do that, Chenerah," she shook her head, "because this is our nation's treasure, untold wealth." "So what?" he asked crossly. "Considering the circumstances, we should stop collecting junk for once and rethink. These are partly working weapons. So, since we hardly have any, they will help in defense. If we fail and people invade, they will steal them anyway. And believe me, they certainly won't be squeamish about it." What suddenly fascinated Chenerah, attracted his attention, was a glass case in the center of the room. In it lay the upper body protector, which in various sagas was considered to be something made of the rock from a meteorite that had struck Alpha Vol hundreds of years ago. The object was matte black, almost anthracite, and reflected the light shining on it only to a minimum. Curiously, the male dog looked at the display case, but did not dare to touch it. The lead dog couldn't see him, but sensed his reluctance and explained, "You don't have to be afraid of it. They say it recognizes fear and rejection. Stay confident and look at it more closely. Feel its energy." He gladly complied with this request as she then unerringly fumbled, opened the display case, and warned, "Are you ready? If you put this thing on, it can mean your death." "I have no choice," he spoke, and she led him as he lifted the armor from its glass case with slightly trembling hands. "It is quite light," he wondered. "Is it certain that this armor is the one from the legends? If it's made of stardust, how can it be so light?" "Me, you, all of us are from this dust, Chenerah. But some of you don't see how much energy they have. It's kind of like that here. Believe me, it's real." Slowly, the male put on the black protective device and felt its accuracy of fit. Impressed, he tested his arm movements, turned his body and found that he could move with excellent flexibility. "And it keeps everything out? No matter what it is?" he asked. "Since I can still hear your voice," the lead dog said joyfully, "I assume that you are still alive. Once again you have shown me that you are the chosen one. A Kesar who deserves to wear it." The male looked at the precious piece and stroked his hands along its upper body. "Kind of sexy," he flattened. The blind woman, however, remained serious and explained that there was currently no material on all of Alpha Vol that could penetrate it. "It is unfortunate, however, that this protection exists only for the orbiting body. They say there was not enough material available for full armor. It will help you resist, but you should be careful that it protects only your heart, not your head." The younger nodded, "Yes, I think what I will need is more brains, but it is necessary to protect what belongs to my country, my heart." "Well spoken," replied the female dog. "It is unfortunate, however, that Amarok did not want to take the Espesetka with him. It doesn't matter, though, as long as he can convince wolves and foxes to help us. Then we have a real chance even without the planned ruse." After Amarok and Serena left the mountains behind, they rode attentively toward Luna. They did not speak a word to each other, not even when the queen dismounted from time to time to relieve herself. They used narrow paths to pass the Hedonaries without the risk of encountering people. It was a detour which the enemies could not know. Certainly, they would not have arrived in Alsatiania yet. As they approached the city, the extent of the destruction the Gajans had left behind on their way to Alsatiania unfolded before their eyes. Stores had been looted, some houses were still burning slightly, and black smoke was rising everywhere. Suddenly Amarok said, "There you see their unwavering will to destroy everything just to satisfy their greed, my queen." "Right you are," the she-wolf confirmed softly, looking sad and angry at the same time. She knew what the human was capable of. She had not thought it possible that this destruction and crudeness could one day strike her own kingdom, but now it did. Man had turned against his ally, the wolf. "There is no alternative now, my king. We must offer peace to the Aramarans, unite and rid our lands of this plague." "I'm glad you noticed that, too," her counterpart hissed snidely, not looking at her. "I'll take you to your palace. I hope it's still standing and habitable." "What about you? Aren't you coming?" she wanted to know. The male did not answer, but rode on. "What happened between you and the Kesar? All this time you have not spoken a word to us." What happened? Amarok sighed and looked at the roadsides. Destroyed houses now dominated the cityscape. Nothing was irreparable, but hardly a building had been opened and searched without violence. Every now and then they met other wolves who stared with blank stares and, brave as they were, had already begun to repair the damage. There was not a soldier to be seen on the street, and downtown Luna seemed unusually quiet. The usual cars of the Gajans had disappeared, and likewise none of their kind could be found. Without exception, they had either headed toward Alsatiania or remained in Arimaria. Who was on which side of the sea could now no longer be clearly said by anyone, for the people on this planet were not controlled or counted. This was handled differently than with the Anthros. "This is my fault," Amarok now spoke, "for they have been searching for me. This must come to an end, my queen. I swore that this sword would not harm a fox or a wolf. But that does not mean that it is the same with the Gajans. If I encounter one of them, I will kill them." After a while, which again passed wordlessly, they arrived at the entrance to the palace garden and looked at the structure. The palace had remained almost intact. Only the plants in the garden were trampled and the entrance gate was broken. "Let's go inside, Your Majesty." "But stay behind me," the younger man ordered, and got down from the pajaka, which his companion followed. They first passed through the garden gate and soon entered the entrance hall, where a servant already met them. "Your Majesty!" he exclaimed delightedly. "You are back. We all thought you had been captured, had already feared the worst." He bowed and kissed the hand of the monarch. The latter spoke, "Everything is in order and they have treated us well. What are the losses here, in Luna? Are all well in the palace?" "There have not been many soldiers left on the ground," the servant explained, "because most of them are in Arimaria. Here in Luna, a great many wolves have been able to hide or have fled to the south. The Gajans have run across your realm, from west to east. In the process they have looted, some of them have burned. A few of our warriors resisted and fell defending your castle, sire." "This is very sad," spoke the queen. "We will ensure retribution as soon as we are fully aware of the situation." Amarok had left earlier to explore the premises. Now he returned with the news that it would be safe here. Quickly, fresh clothes were brought to the queen and a promise was made that the few damages to the structure would be repaired very soon. "A bath is already being drawn for you, and the cooks will see to your sustenance afterwards, Your Majesty," a maid spoke, curtsying at the court, and her queen nodded in agreement. "So you are safe here, Your Majesty," Amarok remarked. "Where are you going now, my king?" asked Serena. "As I said before, I will face the foxes. For this I want you to announce my coming. I hope that Yeremia, as the current ruler, will be willing to talk to me. She already knows me from the past. If I can convince the foxes that the war is over, I'm sure they will help us and the Alsatians send the Gajans home." "Now that Amarok is our consort," the monarch declared, addressing her subjects, "you will follow his instructions. See that he receives everything to make his journey easier. Give him what he asks for." The other wolves nodded, some bowed, showing appreciation and respect for their new king. She continued, "Very well, my dear king. If you so wish, we will not stand in the way of your decision. But be warned, for you do not know whom you will meet on the journey. Please come back safely. Promise me that you will. Do not do anything that will further anger the Aramarans any further. We will speak to their leader. Then she will surely let you go soon, if only for the sake of diplomacy and the end of the war." Sighing, the male nodded and took her hand. "They will let me go. I will do my best, repent and hope to get over it quickly." He looked Serena in the eyes. She was a very beautiful she-wolf, that was for sure, but he would never have gotten sexually involved with her. How could Chenerah have written such crap? What was the point of Serena raping him? Was she pregnant or not? He still could not make sense of it, but he should have enough time to ponder on his journey. He was not angry with her, because Serena was also just a tool. The tool of a crazy person, a Gajan who liked to call himself an architect. As he and his queen parted, each going about their own preparations, he thought of Joliad and the evil developments of recent years. Could everything get better now, and could he, an insignificant wolf, change everything for the better? Would the Kesar and the Alsatians be able to stop the humans until wolves and foxes could rush together to support them? Everything was unpredictable. There was no certainty. What was certain was that all the suffering and pain on Alpha Vol had to end. For a very long time now, this corruption had been going on, and it looked more like worsening than improving. When the wolf had taken a bath, he packed a backpack full of provisions. It would be a long journey. However, public transportation, if it ran, would shorten the trip for him. Before he would run the risk of being recognized, the Aramarans would surely have enough to do with fighting. That his former friend, Chenerah, would thus have to delay the people even longer did not bother him. He always told himself an indifference that was not typical for a Samoyeden, certainly not for him. "Now, Your Majesty, it is time to go," he spoke in a firm voice as he stood before his current wife. The latter had again shed some etiquette and gently embraced him. "Take care of yourself, King Amarok," she begged as he sheathed his sword. King Amarok, how stupid that sounded. He was not a king, only a soldier, a figure in a game that was incomprehensibly violent to him. So he set out and rode through Luna. Again and again he looked around, saw the decay that had begun, the sad wolf faces. They were all shaken. They were all wrong. They were all deceived. And he would awaken them. Amarok looked around, but did not look back. He had done that for many years. Now he had to go forward, use the last remaining opportunity to end the war. He had long since left the capital behind when he sighed sadly and reflected. As he often did, he spoke to himself, "Jolie Yod, I am very sorry for everything. I hope I can end it all and see you again someday. If only I had not betrayed you. If only I hadn't followed in my father's footsteps. We'd be together, we could be happy. Now all that is lost." It was getting dark, so the wolf looked for a place to sleep under a large tree root. He tied the pajaka to the branches and lit a small fire. He did not want to be discovered, but it was already autumn and the nights on Alpha Vol now bitterly cold. He looked up at the sky, which was cloudless and dark, dotted with a few stars. Were the gods up there? Jolie Yod, perhaps. What had become of Jaja now? Was she now the moon itself? Would he ever see her again? The wolf now had many questions for himself, and it amazed him more and more how many truths he had learned in the last few years. His people and that of the foxes did not have to fight a war, because they had both merely succumbed to a religious lie. Nothing had happened as the young Anthros had always been told in childhood. They were all children of two gods, born from the rape of Jaja, Aria, Ianiah. Rape, yes. So would his own child. What a perverted way of thinking this so-called architect had. Amarok would have loved to fly directly to Earth, to meet him personally. But that was not possible. The spaceships of the people flew back and forth between Gaja and Alpha Vol, were just in space. The Agamemnon, which the wolves once stole from the foxes, was ready for flight, but was very closely guarded. Besides, he now had other worries and had to try to end the war so that the humans could be driven away again. The Gajans also succumbed to a mistake. Amarok had planned an attack, but had not gotten around to carrying it out. The fact that Josiah suddenly fired was unforeseeable. Their president did not die by his hand, but in the turmoil that had arisen. Amarok had not fired, but neither had he prevented it from happening. He lay down to sleep and did not take long to close his eyes. Strange images marked his dreams that night. He saw Jolie Yod, the tree he had planted for him, his sword. Perispera ad Astra shone on it. He saw himself striding through Bolmare. The city was destroyed, the sky was grey, and not a soul was to be seen. Surrounded by the destruction, he ran into the large square where the headquarters of the Aramaran despot once stood. Low thunder sounded and rain began to fall. Suddenly the wolf discovered a white statue, which stood there completely intact. It represented a fox, which was unclothed and posed on a pedestal. A golden plaque flashed and on it could be read what Amarok was now saying aloud to himself, Perispera ad Astra. He raised his wet head, looked with fascination at the statue's face, and tilted his head slightly inquiringly when he realized that while on the one hand this fox was confidently pointing to the sky, on the other hand the representation of his hand did not match pointing, the index finger was not outstretched, but slightly curved. Suddenly he woke up and was startled. It had already become light, and he had to go on. While he sat back on his mount, he thought about what all these images in his dreams should mean. What made him dream about this statue? It was interesting that it had not been destroyed, but what was it to him? It was a statue of the Aramarans. Meanwhile, Chenerah gathered his compatriots around him. A scout had told him that man had already started the last stage of the Hedonaries' ascent. They were traveling the rough terrain on foot, the sovereign was told, and that there must be about 10,000 men. All of them carried small and medium firearms, because the way was too arduous for larger equipment. The scout, however, had lied, because a group of people had waited for him, threatened him with weapons and promised him survival. After reporting to the Kesar, he fled, along with his woman and their children. All the dogs that were able to fight now had to defend their country. Nearly 100 males, all armed to the teeth with sharp blades, armed and ready, now stood before their commander, the Kesar of Alsatiania himself. They saluted him and were the only thing standing between the Ispasetka, the origin, and the human greed for power and revenge. Turning their faces expectantly tense towards the mountains, they were sure that the human must have almost arrived. "My dear brothers!" shouted Chenerah, looking into the eyes of his compatriots. "Our scout says that the Gajans will reach us soon. It has been a long time since our nation has faced battle. But we are a nation of warriors, males, made for battle." "Yes!" rang out from 100 throats, and the dogs took up their spears at the same time, only to set them rumbling on the ground. The sovereign continued, "We are few, the people are many. They come in great numbers and carry not swords but ball weapons with which they can kill at a distance. But, you wear strong armor, as do I. You will withstand these metallic bringers of death for as long as it takes. As soldiers, each of you has been taught to stand against many enemies at once. All of you can do it, have proven it time and time again." Now also, a unanimous yes followed, accompanied by the previous gesture, whereupon Chenerah passed the strictly lined-up troop, thoughtfully folded his arms behind his back and sighed. "The Ispasetka, as the center and origin of our being, is now in Alsatiania, here with us. It lies in our lake and is vulnerable as never before. Let us defend this symbol of our firm faith with the weapons of our past. Noble males have carried them and they are the only ones we have at present. They too found their use before for the idea of sovereignty and strength of our ancestors. Their bearers have trusted their strength. So, as I now ask you as the Kesar for your trust, let us persevere until our comrades join us. Let us defend this land and its treasures against the wrath of inferior, naked primates who, driven by greed, have no idea what trust like ours means. Let us trust in ourselves, our strength and our faith. Yes. Brave. Kesar. Strong. Kesar. Together. Kesar." Then the male paused briefly and his gaze met his armor for a brief moment, which had obviously accepted him as its new master. Then, in conclusion, he shouted, "For Alsatiania," which caused his compatriots to repeatedly exclaim his title, Kesar, and, confident and proud, alternately beat their chests and set their spears and lances crashing to the ground. The thunderous noise that this made, however, drowned out another noise that tried to announce with its muffled sound what no one now noticed, the shortcut that the Gajans had unexpectedly taken. The scout, whom Gajaze could no longer have recognized in the ranks of his people, had lied. He knew that now, though not why. The Gajans did not come over the mountains to Alsatiania. The sovereign realized this when he happened to catch sight of a puddle on the rocky ground, its surface vibrating. His amber eyes grew wide, for as his comrades finished their battle cries, the sunlight began to fade. As if in slow motion, the male snapped his muzzle open and moved his head upward, which many soldiers did the same. What more and more covered the sun was a large spaceship in the sky, whose gilded outer skin reflected the light for a moment and blinded him. The writing of the Agamemnon showed, and Chenerah could not grasp what it meant, the enemy was not going the bumpy way through the mountains, but had taken from the Samoyedans their spoils of war, the flagship of Arimaria. "Take cover." The male heard himself still shouting, running off in the direction of a rock wall, when the weapons of the flying machine were fired, and their deadly rays tore a piece out of the ground in the midst of his comrades. A loud bang followed and some dogs flew through the air, whereupon panic and unrest suddenly spread. They all ran away from the impact site in different directions, taking refuge behind rocks, walls and in holes in the ground. A shock. Again, Chenerah opened his eyes and peered past the rock wall. He recognized 3 corpses, their bodies showing large burns and their limbs partially severed. The other dogs had dug in, shouting something to each other in a panic that he didn't understand. He could not concentrate on anything and was dazed, because he had not expected this. Was this the architect's idea? Could he now look to Alsatiania after all and had directed the events again? Gajaze, at any rate, had never considered the spaceship, the possibility that the Earthlings would steal it and use it for themselves. Sure, he had written about this thing long ago, but it was to remain a passing mention after the death of the Aramaran dictator in the Vulpes Lupus Canis. Now that the male no longer had any control over what was happening, any communication with his human self was impossible. The architect could do whatever he wanted without Chenerah even being able to guess what he was really capable of and also willing to do. Kesar. What should we do? A soldier shouted, looking from his nearby hiding place in the direction of the sovereign, who now looked up again and sighed. When the spaceship fired several beams at surrounding rocks, dust and debris were thrown through the air, he was about to admit that he had no idea how to react now. He did open his muzzle, but before he could say anything, many beams of light suddenly emanated from the spaceship from a central point. Chenerah stopped trying to speak and realized that these were the beams of the spaceship's transporter. The humans were beaming off board to meet the Anthros face to face. Run to the beams. They're beaming down. He now shouted, pointing in their direction. Some other soldiers were already answering his call, stabbing their swords into anything that materialized into a human on the ground and came running toward them. There are too many, shouted another fighter, turning to his leader and being shot by an Earthling because of his carelessness. His armor stopped the bullet, however. He became so enraged by it that he lashed out with his weapon, a large metal hammer, and cracked the shooting man's skull. The Gajans, too, were now spreading out over the terrain. There were more and more of them and the transport from the Agamemnon seemed to have no end. They also quickly discovered that the armor of the Canids could not be penetrated by the bullets of their weapons, and so after a few losses they switched to aiming at the heads of their opponents. One of them now took aim with the submachine gun at Chenerah, who was fighting for his part. Chenerah noticed this, drew his sword and ran toward him. A shot followed, but it did not hit the male. He jumped into the air in time, bared his teeth, held the sword vertically and pierced his opponent's skull from above when he hit the ground. Die! He shouted grimly, straining to pull the gun from the lifeless body. He quickly looked around. The place was filled with severed human body parts after only a few moments, but more of their kind followed. It was as if they had brought all their soldiers onto the spaceship just to focus on this one battle, this point. Here, one was surrounded by the mountains and no one who did not know his way around could escape the carnage, this bloody cauldron. Wherever people tried to flee, wounded or in sheer fear, there was no way out. Each direction bounded by a wall. Every way out blocked by a stone. Any escape by blade, hammer, bow and arrow of an enemy forcibly prevented. Chenerah, who was in some ways human himself, knew that these invaders liked to exploit such combat situations for their own benefit whenever they were allowed the upper hand. As he fought his way through the many human soldiers, he realized that they wore the familiar flags of the various nations of Gaja on their camouflage-colored uniforms. This realization made him even angrier, for they were all involved. No country on Earth would not be represented here in an attempt to rob the Alsatians, the beings of Alpha Vol, of the treasures of their world. The uniforms of the Earthlings turned more and more from green to red, but so did the Alsatians, their faces speckled with red paint, their weapons brandishing, their battered jaws, bleeding from their lips, stretched out their deep red fangs toward the sky. They growled, bit, tore flesh from the throats of living bodies with their claws, were wild as animals, unyielding, raw and murderous. All of them, including Gajaze, were in panic, as if in a trance, guided only by the oldest and basest of all feelings, the fear of darkness, of death. Alsatian males were very strong creatures, which before joining the force were trained for many years for endurance, strength, perseverance and murder. However, even their strength knew limits and those of the Kesar were getting closer. His whole body was smeared with blood, so he didn't notice that his protector was hit several times by bullets, but they simply bounced off him without leaving the slightest trace. Other of these bullets flew howling close to his ears and some of his friends were hit in the head when he crossed their paths and they doggedly wrestled with the Earthlings. The noise of their cries for help, mercy, for revenge and death overlapped in Chenerah's ears, so that he could no longer tell them apart. All that was happening was the naked violence that would not end. As people continued to beam down soldiers, more and more Alsatians fell. It was impossible for their leader to count who was still on his feet in the chaos, but more than 2/3 must have already gone down. This contrasted with a much higher number of Gajans. The square was now red with blood, littered with dismembered bodies, torn out arms and legs. In addition to the adrenaline coursing through Chenerah, he also felt the red mist floating through the air that formed whenever a volley of bullets from a machine gun successfully hit its target, an Alsatian. The male was unharmed, but even he could not escape a weakening of his forces and snorted. For a moment he took a breath and looked to the side, bent over, when he could see one of his compatriots, a black shepherd dog with blue eyes. He looked directly at him and fell to his knees, slowly shaking his head with a look of despair. "I'm sorry, Kesar. I can't take it any more," he whispered, which the addressed person could hear despite all the noise. Tears filled the eyes of the friend, whereupon he lowered his head and blood ran from his muzzle. Everything around Chenerah slowed down again, became slow motion, and he locked his eyes. He had to watch in shock as one of the humans held a shotgun to the other male's head from behind. While the defeated, kneeling dog panted exhaustedly and did not raise his head, Chenerah shook his, and the human soldier looked at his bloodied face, breathing exhaustedly but confidently. "No!" shouted the sovereign, but the earthling just stared and pulled the trigger. A loud bang jolted through the air and the head of his comrade in arms was shredded, splattering red. His body remained in the kneeling position before the Gajan contemptuously kicked him in the back so that he fell to the ground. For a moment the shepherd stared stunned, and his look was first fearful, then angry. He tensed all his muscles, set his neck fur and bared his teeth. Walking quickly, oblivious to the world around him, he advanced on the soldier, provoking another shot from his gun. The buckshot hit his protector, and from the pressure his walking was stopped for a split second. The dog reached his enemy, who was now trembling and obviously did not know how to help himself, because he raised the shotgun to strike at him. But the male dog beat him to it, growling full of hatred and aggression. He grabbed the barrel of the gun, snatched it from his adversary and slammed it into his face with full force. The human screamed and fell to the ground. He turned on his back and stretched out his arms in search of protection, but it was no use. Gajaze jumped on his body, took a long swing and stabbed the human face again and again with the muzzle of the shotgun. A lot of blood splattered, the skull made cracking sounds, and its owner stopped moving long ago, but the dog could not stop screaming loudly and ramming the metal forcefully into the lifeless flesh again and again. Guided by base instincts, he yelped loudly at his final blow, then barked and let go of his victim, the rifle now stuck vertically in his head. "I'm going to kill all of you," he growled, lowering his chaps only after impaling a few more adversaries with his sword or severing body parts from them. Now he also felt great exhaustion, began to stagger slightly. His armor might protect his upper body, but not his head. He was not allowed to go to the ground. Then everything would have been over, as it was for many of his friends at that moment. He lost his bearings, snorted, had to fend off blows and bullets with his protector, when suddenly it happened, from somewhere the blow of a gun hit him right in the face. He lost his footing on the rock, which had become slippery with blood, and fell backwards to the ground. For a moment his eyes went black. A whistling sound started in his ears and he had trouble getting up again. Everything now looked to him like an opaque mass of colors. Green uniforms of the people. Brown, black, white fur of Alsatians. Red tones of the blood and innards. The blue of the sky. The sounds were muffled, shouts and commands from both sides could no longer be understood. But there was still the sky. What is happening? He wondered as he looked up with one eye squinted shut. The spaceship, which occupied part of the sky, no longer emitted transporter beams. It wavered in flight instead of holding its position. Up there, aboard the Agamemnon, something seemed wrong. Slowly, the airship slid sideways from its position, coming closer and closer to the ground. Dazed, Kesar struggled to keep his eyes open. Blood covered his face and he staggered, bent over, through the fighters who paid no attention to him. He looked around and realized that there must be only about 10 Alsatians still standing on their paws and fighting. All the others were dead and their bodies were indistinguishable from all the others, for the ground was only smeared with red paint and covered with the flesh of the fallen. The spacecraft kept descending and Chenerah was sure it would hit the ground and explode in a few seconds, whatever the reason had to be. He hoped it would come down far enough away from them, and so he repeated over and over in his mind, "Please don't. Please don't. Before the Agamemnon hit the ground, however, many new transporter beams were activated at the same time, after which it was clear to the shepherd soldier, this was to be the end of the Alsatians. Not half of the Gajans had killed them and more would come. Their armor and the elevated positions of some dogs would no longer be enough. They would all die and man would then win everything, reduce the world to rubble. But suddenly he realized that no more enemies were beamed, but Alsatians. His compatriots and friends, comrades in arms and brothers were there. More and more of them materialized and immediately started to fight upon their arrival. Taken completely by surprise, many Earthlings reacted very late to the enemy, who now came running at them from behind in ever-increasing numbers. Immediately with the beginning of this counterattack, countless of them lost their lives by laser weapons, swords and small arms. Visibly confused, the sovereign listened as a unison battle cry threatened to swallow all other noise. He straightened up again and the beeping in his ears ended. "Yes. There you are at last," he shouted joyfully, throwing his arms in the air and drawing new courage. Immediately he continued to participate with all his remaining strength in the fight, the outcome of which had now been decisively changed. Ripped snouts, flashing fangs, belonged to courageous and motivated-looking, strong, battle-hungry warriors, who fearlessly attacked everything that was alive and did not wear a fur coat. A real slaughter ensued and there were countless casualties on both sides of this conflict. But the dogs were now clearly superior in numbers and weapons, encircled the enemies bit by bit and pulled the resulting entanglement tighter and tighter. A dull rumble then suddenly interrupted any fighting action for a few seconds and all participants abruptly looked in the same direction. The spaceship had come down some distance away in uninhabited mountains and now exploded with a widely audible, deafening bang. A huge fireball went skyward and turned into an even wider mushroom cloud. The blaze of flames could be seen in the mountains. Thus it was now clear, the ship of the Aramarans, the largest and strongest of this time, it was now destroyed forever. For a few seconds, the armies looked at what was happening, only to fight on from one moment to the next. The fact that the spacecraft had now exploded hit the humans especially hard. They had left reserve soldiers on board and these must now have all burned to death. "My Kesar. Let's keep rounding them up. Let's shrink the circle." A comrade shouted strained at Chenerah and continued firing his laser weapon at Earthlings. "Let's go." The sovereign confirmed and nodded. The Gajans were gradually rounded up, inch by inch. Although some of them, in view of the hopeless situation, threw down their weapons and raised their arms in surrender, Chenerah gave his cronies loudly to understand that there could be no mercy now. They all had to die, whether they repented or were simply afraid. What they were about to do, what they had already done, it was enough for the devastating judgment of the shepherd dogs. They tightened the encirclement, killed them all. There was no escape, and their screams became less. A mountain of human bodies piled up between the Alsatians. Red was the dominant color of punishment. Lifeless strangers, stacked, torn and riddled with holes. Even when none of their bodies seemed to move, the dogs stabbed the pile of flesh with blades, just to be sure. Torn, empty eyes stared out of bloodied faces. Broken bones and intestines protruded from between the sacks of meat. The dust of the fighting slowly settled and small clouds of soot from burnt flesh rose. The stench was terrible. "It smells like piss," a dog soldier spoke, spitting contemptuously at the crowd. He walked away and sat on a rock, where he jammed his sword into a crevice in the ground and dropped the laser pistol. Gradually, his comrades also desisted from the beaten remains of the field, some forming a circle around them and taking their loincloths aside just so they could urinate on the Earthlings. Chenerah, watching this, hearing the sound of splashing urine, did not participate in this degrading, obscene gesture, but he did not want to deprive his friends of their relief. A somewhat unsightly Alsatian tradition was to regard slain enemies as prey and mark them as property. A wolf-like howl from everyone followed, whereupon the first dogs already began to bring in wood from the supplies of their dens. Gajaze let some time pass and went to the leader to tell her about the success of the battle. Artos, who was assigned to guard and defend the spiritual leader whenever necessary, was no longer with her. Fortunately, the human did not even reach the center of the village of Ketharin. "It's done, lead dog. The Gajan is gone. We in the Ispasetka are now safe again," spoke the male. "Yes," nodded the blind woman, "and you did very well. It's amazing that your brothers made it here in time. How did they do it?" I heard they were on the spaceship with the humans. How is that possible? I talked to a couple of them. They say they rebuilt one of the big antennas in Arimaria, which then allowed them to use its portable beamer again. They teleported undetected into the Agamemnon's cargo hold and then took it over. She nodded silently, but seemed satisfied. Say, where is Artos? Shouldn't he be protecting you? The younger man asked in wonder, looking around. The leader answered him by saying that his friend would not have let her out of his sight until the last moment of the fight, but then he had to do something on her behalf. He was gone. Where to? She did not tell her counterpart. The leader dog offered him some tea and asked that he sit down, but the sovereign had other things on his mind. If you don't mind, I'd like to go after my friend Amarok. After all, he is on his way to Arimaria all by himself. Perhaps he is already there. I can't possibly abandon him. No matter what happened between us. But the old woman decisively denied. Let him go, Chenerah. If he wants to turn himself in, let him do so. He's old enough, and I'm sure he'll be all right. But, leader. No buts, Kesar. You should recover first. Besides, you can't leave now. As it has always been, today, after gathering the fallen enemy, there will be a celebration. So? He asks, unperturbed. You'll be able to have a party on your own, won't you? It's much more important that I find Amarok. What if something happens to him? The decision has been made. Sovereign or not, you can't just break with our traditions. Tomorrow you can go wherever you want. But today your people need you by their side. Many have fallen, many have lost a brother. They need their sovereign, you. The Alsatian ruled and sipped her tea. The male sighed. There were traditions even for the sovereign of Alsatiania that he had to submit to, whether he wanted to or not. All right, he relented, while the female dog grinned contentedly, I'll stay. But only for a while. As soon as the festivities are over, I'll go after him. I need to reach Amarok, to stand by him. He closed his hand confidently, whereupon his mistress only shrugged her shoulders. Love. I think it is something that very quickly takes us off course if we follow it. Nevertheless, if you want, you can go then, yes. Now you two tend to your wounds and celebrate yourself. As they too will do. It is deserved, she spoke in conclusion, after which the Kesar bowed briefly and left. When evening came, the Alsatian warriors had piled up several piles of wood into funeral pyres, on which they placed the shells of the killed enemies. The women and pups, who had been hiding in the mountains, had returned in the meantime and had prepared a feast. The duty of their sovereign, who in the meantime had bandaged his wounds and taken off the protector again, was to give a victory speech. However, he promised himself to formulate it as briefly as possible, because after all he did not feel like celebrating. The leader was right, Chenerah should thank his compatriots, because after all, it was thanks to their courageous intervention at the last moment and a good plan that the realm of the dogs still existed at all. He himself would have failed with his 100 comrades, he was sure. When everyone had sat down at the long tables in the open air, served beer and food, and begun to eat, he stood in the center of the large village square and spoke in a firm voice, My dear brothers and sisters. We have won a great victory today, man is defeated, swept away from our land. I am proud to have led you. All round, rapid tapping on tabletops followed. 100 males couldn't do much against them. I'm glad the rest of you rushed to our aid. To be honest, we didn't think we'd make it. It's only thanks to you guys that we survived. I want to thank you on behalf of the leader dog, our nation and all the fallen brothers for standing by us in this difficult and hopeless situation. As if from one throat, males and females shouted, Kesar. The men one sighed loudly, paused briefly and then spoke, You did not do it for me, but for all of us. For our kingdom and the Ispasetka. For peace and the destruction of evil. Let us bury our dead and mourn their loss. Again he paused and walked slowly among the set tables so that he could look directly into the faces of most of his people with his amber eyes. He saw their pride, joy, relief and strength. The Lord Sovereign concluded in a loud voice, And let us also burn the brood of primates, that they may never set foot on our land again. At this, he jerked his right arm skyward, his hand clenched into a fist, showing his fangs. Again and again it sounded Kesar. Kesar. Kesar, and the leader dog, who had crossed her arms contentedly, smiled. They had done it. Ispaseka, the focus of the world, the sanctuary of 3 nations, was safe. However, the battle did not officially end until the pyres were set on fire and great clouds of smoke, black as death itself, rose into the sky. A group of talented males and females played music on flutes, violins and drums, which would have seemed rather medieval to a human. But now there were no more people who could have heard these sounds. That would have been difficult anyway with all the talking, laughing, singing and clapping. Dogs heard better than primates, as it was also true for Gaja. It got very late that evening and at some point the first soldiers fell down drunk where they had just been sitting happily. Their spiritual leader also soon said goodbye to her friends and let someone lead her home. Chenerah, who had taken part in numerous conversations and hugs of his compatriots, had not drunk from the beer, had not eaten from the numerous dishes. He did not feel like celebrating, although there was every reason. He felt tired and in pain. The battle had taken its toll on him, too. So he decided not to go out in the middle of the night, but to get some sleep beforehand. Before that, he had a comrade give him one of those Aramaren beam units. He looked at this little device, which looked like a remote control, and smiled. These things saved our butts today, he thought to himself, and went to find a room. He remembered that when he wrote Vulpes Lupus Canis, he had mentioned beaming, but he would never have thought that it would become so important. He could save himself a lot of time even now, if Aramario were not so far away and the spaceship had not been destroyed. He could not beam himself now. He wondered whether the architect could have written down the text in this way. After all, he could not have overlooked Alsatiania, but he must have followed how the shepherds made the plan to take over Agamemnon in Aramaria. Whatever had led to this, whoever had had this glorious idea, it had worked, and that was the crucial thing. Gajaze knew that there had to be a reason for everything that was happening. Even if his human self couldn't directly intervene in what was happening in Alsatiania, he could everywhere else, which in turn could lead to changes in the dog kingdom. Why did he always have to brood so much? Couldn't such philosophical questions at least stop now, after a successful day? That didn't seem to work, because Chenerah was the thinker, a better steer than a warrior. Outside, moreover, a few dogs were still slurring their songs and laughing. So it took him quite a while today, too, before he finally found some well-deserved sleep. Once again he dreamed one of those profound, incomprehensible dreams whose content was quite clear but whose meaning was very difficult to grasp. He stood with his back in front of a closed door and looked into a white room. In the middle of it was a hospital bed, on which I was lying and sleeping. Suddenly a black cloud appeared on my right, which gradually condensed into a silhouette. The dog didn't understand what was happening, and when he took a step forward, trying to figure it out, he ran straight in front of an invisible force field. Ouch! He shouted and briefly held his fang. What is this? Am I on Gaja? Isn't that the architect? He asked himself, while the smoke had now taken the form of an anthro, whose species the dog did not recognize. Kesar watched this strange creature as it bent over me and spoke ancient Egyptian. The Alsatian did not understand this language, but noticed that this dark creature must be some kind of dog. He tried with all his might to overcome the invisible barrier with his hands, but he did not succeed. Chenerah felt that this creature could not have anything good in mind and understood that it was I who was lying there, he in human form. However, I understood who was standing next to me. It was the jackal god, whom we humans called Anubis. I, who always honored him under his name Yanapua, recognized him immediately, knew what he wanted from me. With my eyes wide open, I stared at him pleadingly. I was not yet ready for what the god of the dead seemed to have in mind for me. The Vulpes Lupus Canis was not yet finished. I hadn't said everything yet. It was not yet time, I did not want and was not allowed to die yet. Everything in the room dark and visibly and unable to help, Chenerah could only wait and see what the jackal would do. Again and again he called for me, for the stranger, and that he should leave me alone. He was trapped behind unreal glass, only a meter away from the action and yet so far away. What do you want from me? I asked hoarsely, feeling a mysterious force take my breath away. The snout of the creature of the gods came closer to my face until it almost touched it, as I gasped convulsively for air and fear of the end filled my weakening spirit. Now, the god spoke in a deep, echoing voice, you embrace the darkness. He opened the muzzle and sucked the life out of my body piece by piece. Full of pain and fear, I opened my mouth and could see that a mist was escaping from me, which the beast inhaled. I felt, this should be the end, and I was much too weak for any resistance. As much as I resisted, throwing my whole body back and forth, I could not do anything. Every part of me ached and went limp as my eyes began to turn into white, lifeless beads, my skin wrinkling and graying. Whispering, frightening voices pierced my thoughts, and the world around me changed to silhouettes, outlines that grew fainter and more indistinct the closer I came to death. Gajaze suddenly realized with amazement that he was carrying the sword of his friend Amarok. However, since this was a dream, he did not wonder where it came from, but drew it, anticipating that the jackal would react to it. "Stop! Stop it! You are Anubis, Yanapa, aren't you?" he shouted. "I have the key here, and therefore the right to be heard by you." The jackal promptly stopped what he was doing and turned his head towards the shepherd. The latter had stretched his arm wide so that his hand, which held Amarok's sword with the inscription Per Aspera ad Astra, penetrated the invisible barrier. "The way to the past!" exclaimed Yanapa in shock, adding, "So be it, dog." He let go of me and the mist abruptly returned to my body. The world became bright and clear again, and I watched as the Egyptian god and also the protagonist of my story dissolved and disappeared like spirit beings. I had gotten away, and the jackal, thanks to my canine self, would have to wait a bit longer for me. I couldn't thank my son and friend for that, not yet. Gajaze found himself in a dark room with a beam of light shining through what he thought was the ceiling, directed at him like a spotlight. Slightly blinded by it, the dog tried to move, but stood stiffly calling Yanapa's name. A moment later, another beam appeared and shone on the jackal sitting on a throne. This one asked, "What do you have to say, Alsatian? Make haste, for my time is a resource that is finite." Kesar looked up and recited what his request was. "Yanapa, this person you were about to take away is not ready yet. He doesn't deserve to die yet. Please, give him a second chance." The other spoke with a loud, angry voice, "Who or what do you think you are, wanting to tell me, a god, what he has to do? You, who are only the fiction of a man. Insignificant, not real, small and weak." This statement infuriated Chenerah, who bitingly declared, "And who or what do you think you are? You, too, are only a product of human imagination and fiction. You are no more real and genuine than I am. You, too, were invented by someone thousands of years ago in order to make life and death understandable and tangible. You are nothing other than me, fictitious and not alive." Unimpressed by the dog's courage, the god of the underworld declared, "I recognize your loyalty to him, and also I see a certain strength and fearlessness in you. You are part of him, and thus you are afraid of perishing together with him. It is remarkable that his spirit in the form of yourself tries to hold on to life, but it is not me who decides about life and death. Like you, dog, I am also only servant of a higher existence leading me." The Alsatian narrowed his eyes and asked for the name of this existence which had to decide about life and death. However, the Egyptian only shook his head. "So bring forward how you want to defend this human, Alsatian, so that I can present your request to the gods." Relieved, the sheepdog sighed, "Okay, so. Bear in mind," the other interrupted him harshly, "that this is your one, last chance to be persuasive. Finish your lecture and you may instantly decide the life and death of this insignificant human being." Kesar now knew that he had to make an effort, everything had to be said, much had to be argued and substantiated. He did not know what to start with, because this request hit him unprepared. "This insignificant person, as you say," he began after a moment's thought, "is my father, my brother. He is my guide in the darkness of my world, my protector and mentor. If you take him to the world of the dead, then I die, everyone on my planet dies. Everything he has ever thought and felt, who he is and what values he stands for, I am, we all are on Alpha Vol. He's still young, and he can accomplish so much more." "So you think he's accomplished something in his life?" "Yes," Chenerah confirmed confidently. "He didn't? And I will also explain to you how the gods come up with it." "I'm curious about that." The jackal raised the hand, which held a golden scepter, and let run before the astonished-looking male a film, which consisted of short incoherent sequences. Here, the divine voice underlined the content of the images and their meaning in an explanatory way. Born in the land of peace and wealth, surrounded by self-evident luxury. Withdrawn and being the only son, he always felt his otherness. He survived by imitating the behaviors of others and adapting to the reality that presented itself to him at that time. Time passed, years went by in which he did nothing but live up to the expectations of the other people around him. What had he achieved? He tied his uniqueness to everyone's nose. Everyone knew that he was peculiar, disturbed. In the absence of parental love, he was incapable of loving a person himself. Yet he cultivated a sexual orientation that had nothing to do with procreation, rather than ever passing on any of the values you speak of. His behavior was not a crime, Kesar calmly interrupted. Not a lot of it. But you know he also hurt, harmed and injured a lot of people. Of course. But this is something that everyone does, not just him. If it were up to that, everyone would have to die immediately, and some of them, especially very powerful ones, would deserve death even more than he does. I don't think his nature and his faults alone can be the justification for him to die. The shepherd folded his arms. It could not be that one wanted to punish his creator for something completely natural, normal. He crossed clear lines. Chenerah spoke, pointing to the moving images whose content changed and showed things from my life that I would have preferred to forget and bury forever, as would my protégé. Embarrassed by this, Kesar lowered his head, but an invisible force emanating from the god of the dead forced him to continue looking at the images. Yes, I know, Chenerah confirmed and sighed. He has made mistakes, done unforgivable things. However, his book, My World, is an apology to life. It is what I meant by accomplished. He is sorry. He always was, no matter what he did, how he decided, and what came out of it in the end. He's not to blame for everything. You know that as well as I do, knowing his life as well as I do. The jackal made the pictures disappear and asked his counterpart if this book, Vulpes Lupus Canis, was not a little too small to call it a life's work or a legacy. He said that many other people on earth understood much more about what the meaning of life was: love, greatness and honor. Gajaze looked thoughtfully and spoke, this person is the best example of the fact that the meaning of life must be whatever we think it is. Some seek love, peace, recognition and attention, others power, wealth, knowledge. Reduced to one word, every living being does one thing: strive. The life of this young man began cruelly, went cruelly and will end damn cruelly. Nothing can be done about it now. He has found the meaning of his life by wandering through time as long as he could, just to leave something to someone and to show gratitude for his past life. To make up for everything he ever screwed up. Very true, Chenerah nodded and looked at Gajaze for a moment. Smart you are, dog, and sincere. I'm impressed by how loyal you are to him. Tell me, though, do you think the gods should feel sorry for anyone who never really filled life with love, but wasted his time in it, just because he ended up apologizing for it? No, it shot out of the sheepdog, I don't think so. But did the gods seriously expect him to write a romance novel about his life instead of an apology? Not after everything that's happened. Not after his life has made him what he is now. I know it's certainly wiser to commit his life to kindness and fulfilling his dreams. And after all, he has demonstrably almost achieved the second point by writing his story. If only the gods would give him a little more time to bring it to a kind end. The Egyptian looked down for a moment and it looked as if he was listening to a voice whispering in his ear. Then he looked up and stepped very close to the Alsatian, who was still immobilized but did not resist. Questioningly, Kesar looked at his counterpart, whose eyes stared seriously and noticeably penetrated his inner self. Well spoken, dog, Chenerah praised. The gods are convinced. But what do you offer them in exchange for sparing this human life? What do you mean? Asked Gajaze incomprehensibly. For everything we want to achieve, we have to pay a certain price. What is yours? Well, Chenerah pondered for a moment, then spoke, take my life for his. Now the jackal laughed softly, yes, dog, I will. An attractive offer, because after all, the gods would like to see your spirit and those of your two friends, Amarok and Joliad, with all their qualities, added to the collective of the dead. You are a figment of the imagination and therefore essentially immortal. The gods would never get a single one of you, not even if that person died. One day I will come to you and get your three souls at the same time. Not today, not tomorrow. You will know when that time comes. You mean, all three of us are to follow you into the realm of the dead, the Duat? That's right, Chenerah confirmed. You are connected to each other. Alone, Neither of you is of any value. Only your combination forms something that can be called a spirit, a soul. Accept or watch your maker die, dog. Briefly, Chenerah thought, that was a very high price. How was he supposed to decide for his two friends? Was he even allowed to do that? He couldn't just let his human counterpart die, though. The Vulpes Lupus Canis had not yet been fully told. It still needed time. So it's a deal then? He then wanted to know. Once your souls are added to the collective of the underworld, you will be gone from your man's thoughts. He will forget you. Everyone will forget you and your world. You should be aware of that before you agree, dog, the jackal admonished, to which his counterpart nodded confidently and explained that he possessed no riches and nothing else that outweighed a human life. The Egyptian also nodded, so that's how it should be, and held out his open hand to him in a demanding manner. The sheepdog did not understand. The sword, Chenerah said, is mine. You have now used this key and its purpose is fulfilled. Return it so that no one can bother me again. Sighing, the Alsatian took the sword from its scabbard and held it out to the god of the dead, who now smiled and dissolved it into thin air with magic. Now, the god said in conclusion, return to your world and do whatever your master told you to do in his story. When it is done, we will meet again. The male agreed to again and instantly crumbled to dust. Startled, he woke up and thought about this strange dream that seemed to have come out of nowhere. This creature, Chenerah, what was it doing in his mind? Had this really happened, in another reality? Why did he have Amarok's sword with him? As realistic as his dream had felt, as many questions he now asked himself, that was now beside the point. He decided to follow Amarok as quickly as he could.